All right, everybody. Hello, my friends. You beautiful people out there in the world. You conscious folks. You happy people. I know you happy. You happy people out there. You watching me on Strong Inspirations. People who watch me are happy people. I'm a happy guy, and I thank you for coming to the channel to share the channel, to do what you do, to know the history that the people that I bring on the channel tell you. And then you might even take it a little bit further and do some more research, because I know we don't give it all to you. And sometimes my guests come back on more than once. These people, let me tell you something. My man that's on the channel, he can't hear me. He's an expert. He know what he's talking about. He got books in the background, and I think he's a nice guy, because he tells me he's excited to be on Little Old Me channel. The train has left the station and is not coming back, because there's a bunch of stuff that we can talk about from all the angles. And you're going to really like what my guest has got to tell you today. I'm so excited that he has come on the channel. Now check it out. Have you seen the video of the lady who talks about how African Americans, Black people, first got to America before 1619? A lot of them in the first days went down to Florida, because Florida was not really a part of America at the time. Watch that video. Did you see the one where the guy was in jail with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? He sat beside him in the jail cell because he was one of the organizers of a march in Albany, Georgia. And Dr. King was put in the jail. They were sitting there talking buddy, and so on and so forth. Watch that video. Did you see the video where we talk about the Negro Baseball League, where I interviewed the guy out of Kansas City, Missouri, with the Negro League Baseball Museum? He said, I tell you the truth, man, a lot more people were coming to the Negro League games than they were coming to the regular games. And then they knew that, the regular games, and that's when they said, hold on, we missing out on an opportunity here. We got to expand. And that's when they brought in Jackie Robinson. Watch that video. Did you watch? Have you seen the video I did with the guy? He said one day he was in the park, and he, jogging or what have you. He sees some guy come out of the swimming pool with a scuba suit on. He was scuba diving in the swimming pool, training and what have you. He go over there and say, hey, man, what you doing? He said, I know how to swim. That looks interesting. The guy ended up starting an organization called Diving with a Purpose, and he has dove for sunken slave ships. Watch that video. Did you see the one I did with the lady out of Ireland? She talks about slavery in Ireland and then how they came to America. Watch that video. Oh man, there's a ton of them on the channel, and you're gonna like this video. So come on, my friends, and I forgot to say this. Every now and then I get super excited. My name is Anthony Brogdon. I forgot to tell you who I am. I'm the guy who hosts this and kind of came up with this idea. And I enjoy doing it. I mean, this is my calling. I like this. And so hit the subscribe button on the channel. Hit the like button on this video, because you're going to like this. Watch, without a doubt. I bet money on that. You're going to like this video. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up. You get notified. You get a ding, electric shock, or something, because you want to watch this, and then share it with people. Share it with your kids. Share it at work. Tell them, hey, let's take, and then you can move the cursor and you can get to where you want to go on the video. It's that easy. And then tell somebody about Strong Inspiration. Don't keep it to yourself. Share the link. Tell somebody, and all they got to do is go to YouTube, type in Strong Inspiration, and we're the first one that come up, the only one that come up when you do that. Now, a couple more things. Things are moving well on this Black History Festival that I'm having. That's right, I'm having one in Kansas City, Kansas. You're gonna like this. You need to be there. I can only take 1,000 of you though. And it's very reasonably priced. I feed you, I get you in, you get all my events, and you get a goodie bag. For the weekend of Memorial Day, May 27th to 29th. Watch the video I did, there's about 6, 7 videos about Kansas, but watch the one I did with the Anthony Hope guy, who says how his great-great-grandfather escaped from Missouri and ended up in Quintero. It's a phenomenal story. When I heard it, I said, I got to go see this for myself. And so that's the premise behind Freedom Quintero. We're going to party in a barn on Friday, so wear your dusty blue jeans. Don't get dressed up, because you're going to get dusty. We got hay everywhere and all that other, but it's clean, but still, nonetheless. And then we're going to take tours, and we're going to do the picnic. And check this out. When you got a picnic, the people cook the food on the site. I'm not having it catered. We're going to have people cook and grill the food right there, so you can get a burnt hot dog that's hot. So that's Memorial Day weekend, May 27th through the 29th, 2022, and I call it Freedom Quintero. As many of you might already know who've been watching me, I'm a filmmaker. This is my film here. It's called businessintheblack.net. Ooh, this is powerful. Not just because I did it, but I had a few other people tell me that. Watch this. It's streaming on Amazon. Slaves who went to college, Black millionaires in the 1800s, ways people escaped slavery, how we learn how to read and write. And I named names. It's in my film. I then wrote the book because people said, hey, I really like that. And you got some things in there I don't know. I said, well, maybe it's easier just to put it in book form. And then I added more. It's more facts in this book, man. This is 200. This is 200 facts. You got to get you a copy of this and get it autographed. I autograph it for you. I have no problem with that. And every 10th book I sell, I donate one to a school, because if I didn't learn it in school, I got a feeling a lot of other schools are not teaching this. And it's easy to read. Get you a copy of that. Now, everything, just go to my website, which is businessintheblack.net. I got it all up there. You see all I'm doing. You can buy the book. You can register for the Black History Festival, so on and so forth. And you hear me use this word strong a lot. Strong is my favorite word. I just like it. I've been saying it for a long time. And in my world, strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to the man on the channel. He's a strong guy. Watch out. That's what everybody say about him. He's strong, and he come on Strong Inspiration. So introduce yourself. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So I'm Robert Schwaller. I'm a associate professor at the University of Kansas. And I work primarily on the history of the African diaspora in Spanish America. So I'm interested in both the Africans that they come over, but also I've written a lot about the next generations, right? So the children of Africans born in the Americas. Often, one of my dissertation, my first project, looked at a lot at how Africans made families with indigenous people, and in Mexico with mestizos. So those are people that are already sort of indigenous and Spanish.
Yeah.
And so I've been really interested in tracking the history of African and indigenous encounters.
Okay, let me stop you right there.
Sure.
You know what we do. I got to ask a couple questions about you.
You do it.
If you don't mind. Where are you from originally?
I was born in Florida, but that was because my dad was a professor down there. My family, my mom was from New York, is where she was born, and her dad was from Pennsylvania. Her mom was from Minnesota, North Dakota, and my dad's side of the family was from Kansas.
Did you and I don't mean no disrespect to it. Where you grew up? Did you grow up knowing Black people? Put it that way.
I I did. When I was in grade school in Florida, where we lived, it wasn't super diverse, but one of my first friends I remember from grade school was a young Black kid named Andy Reid. And so I remember growing up with them. I've moved to parts of the country that have not been as diverse. I lived in Montana for high school,
Sure.
and in upper Minnesota, that's far more Scandinavian than Black. But where I am now, as you say, you're having this Quintero side. I live in Lawrence, Kansas,
Okay.
and there's a great Black history, particularly here in eastern Kansas and western Missouri.
Okay. Let me ask you this. If you didn't, how did you come to, okay, growing up under those scenarios and living those towns, what's the take of Black people? I mean, you having the consciousness that you have, and there's none around. All you see is some news, some good, some bad. How does that affect people?
Yeah, well,
how did it affect you?
How about I tell you how I got to being interested in studying Black folk in the past? Yeah.
Yes.
So I got to it through Latin America. So my dad is a professor. He's written books, lots of books about the history of the church, the Catholic Church in Latin America. And so particularly when I was in high school and college, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And because I'd grown up being in places like Mexico where I could climb on Aztec pyramids, or I could go to Spanish forts, right? In Florida, I'd go down to like St. Augustine, up to St. Augustine. And so I wanted to do archaeology, but I wasn't able to take the classes. And so I ended up doing more studies in culture and history. And so I ended up going into the same general field as my dad, which was Latin American cultural history. And I traveled through Latin America. So I've always been interested in how diverse Latinos or Latin Americans are, right? Because if you're in Mexico, you see lots of folks that have indigenous heritage.
Right.
But then if you go to places like Veracruz, you see a lot more Black Mexicans, right?
Okay.
I traveled through Buenos Aires, which is, a really very European city. But it's got this very rich Black history that goes all the way back to the 1600s and late 1500s.
Okay.
And so I'd always known of this, how diverse racially Latin America was.
Sure.
And then when I got to graduate school to do my PhD, the thing that at first I was going to do religious history. I was going to study how Catholic missionaries converted the Aztecs. And I took a class, my first class at graduate school, with Ben Vincent, who's an amazing Black historian. He does the history of Mexico. He's written a couple books about Black militiamen in Mexico. And he did a class for me on race and the history of race in Latin America. And it was that class that totally changed my perspective. And I said, you know what I want to study? I want to study how people in the past created racial categories and also navigated them, right? So someone who's African or whose parents are African and indigenous, how do they understand their own racial category? What do they call themselves? How do they move in society if people see them as a mulatto or a morisco? How does that work?
Okay, let me stop you there. I'm gonna get a little deep on you in this regard. Coming from your background, when we talk about that perspective, and from a Black perspective, most of it is not good. Mm-hmm. For the most part. I mean, it's the enslavement, it's the brutality, so on and so forth. How does that affect you? Does that affect you to say, wow, not just the resilience, but how evil people can be? I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Throughout the whole civilization, there's been evil stuff that have happened to Black people.
Absolutely.
What does that do for you?
Yeah, so that was like one of the big questions for my dissertation, like that I wanted to study was the intersection between all of that badness, right? The way in which European Spaniards came up with these horrible ideas about what Black folk are and how their bodies and all of that. How did they come up with that? But then the flip side is I wanted to understand how people of color, and for my dissertation, I was looking both at people with African ancestry, but also people that were indigenous and mixed indigenous ancestry. So how did they manifest that resilience? How did they push back? How did they resist? How did they carve out a space for themselves? And so what I find in the dissertation is they do it all sorts of ways. They do it by working really hard and getting jobs that either give them space to sort of be themselves. Sometimes that means like cowboys, black cowboys. I'm sure that I think you even had an interview with a black cowboy, right?
Right.
So, and in Mexico, they're black cowboys in the 1540s. In 1540s, there's black cowboys in northern Mexico.
Okay.
And that's a space where even if they're enslaved, because the slave, the owner, the person who's owning them is in Mexico City or someplace else, there's still space for them, right? They're not, it's not the same conditions as maybe on a plantation. And the thing that has really moved me and sort of gotten me to the project that I'm doing right now is really trying to understand how Africans and people of African descent and indigenous people like found common ground and worked together to push back or to create spaces for themselves against that sort of European, increasingly sort of white understanding of what blackness is or indigeneity is, all of these things.
Okay, I got one for you. How about this? And then we're going to get to the topic really at hand. And I don't know why it's on my heart to ask you these, but let's say that you are at a presentation where you're the speaker, or even in the classroom, and you got these, you got a few black kids, but you got mostly white kids, and then you said something to them that said, let me tell you what has happened. And, you know, we talk about, and I'm not going down the critical race topic, but we talk about that. And we say what's happened and how we've done this to the people, but then you enlighten them in some way. Is that your ha-ha moment? Is that your best? Is that your good moment when you walk away and said, I told them something that I know it changed my mind and it changed their mind for the better, or just to making it real? And then you can say, and you can smile when you get back in your office, say, I know I got somebody today.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the best classes that I've taught here at the University of Kansas was a class on, it's called Slavery in the Americas. So, you know, it's obviously, you know, it's not exclusively about Black folk, but there are indigenous enslaved persons. But that was a class that was really fun to teach because it had more Black students. We don't have a lot at University of Kansas, but there were in that class because it's a history that they want to know more about.
Right.
And I had lots of white kids, you know, from Western Kansas, where my family's from, and parts of Missouri. And that was a class where everyone learned something, right? Because, you know, as some of the speakers that you've had on here show, there's a lot of Black folk in the US that don't know the history of Black folk in Latin America. So there was lots of histories that were new to everyone. And so when you can have a moment and everyone in the room is like, I had no idea that there were Black conquistadors. That's a really great teaching moment to talk about.
I'm sure. So now as we go to it, you've written several books, right? Let's take one topic and then we'll move along to another one. Like you just, the one you just talked about, Black conquistadors, if I'm pronouncing that right. What's that story?
Well, that's a story. I didn't write that book. But sure. So that's actually my advisor at Matthew Restall at Penn State wrote an article on Black conquistadors, and I've talked about them in a couple places as well. And so I think even Jane was talking about this when she was on. But there are a number in 1492 and certainly between 1492 and the 1550s, there are a lot of Africans in Spain and in Portugal, and a lot of them are already freed. And a lot of the Spaniards who are coming over to be conquistadors in places.
What is a conquistador? How about that? What is that?
Right. So that's what the Spanish call the folks that actually go and fight Native Americans to create new colonies for the Spanish. So a lot of those guys that are coming over, some of them bring enslaved Africans with them, and especially if things are tough, they're going to have their enslaved Africans fight alongside. But there's also free people of African descent who want to get ahead the same way that the Spaniards want to get ahead by fighting and for the king and winning territory. And so I know that you heard a little bit about Juan Garrido from Jane. He's one of them. But there's some really amazing stories of guys who started out enslaved and then went on and either got their freedom or basically lived relatively independent lives. There's a couple Black conquistadors that fight in conquests in the Caribbean, in Mexico. They go to Central America. They end up down in Chile. They go all over the place.
Okay, let me stop you there. So what happens is, see, because a lot of us, and I know I'm guilty of this until I, started interviewing people such as yourself. Everything starts out of Africa. Let's go back to that. Okay, sure. So people in general, civilization, kind of, it all starts out of Africa, and then things start moving around.
Yeah.
How does Black people get to Spain to be in Spain at those years? Let's start there and then go to, and you've alluded to what some have done.
Yeah, so there's two ways, right? And both of them, for the most part, have to do with slave trades. So there's a very old slave trade that we call the TransSaharan trade. So that happens, and it's usually it begins as some of the Muslim caliphates in North Africa begin to send people over the Sahara Desert to places like Ghana and Mali, and start creating trading networks into that part of West Africa. And so beginning as early as like the 12 and 1300s, there's a few enslaved Africans from West Africa that begin to sort of go up through the Sahara to places like North Africa.
Okay.
And because North Africa and the southern part of Spain are both controlled by Muslim kingdoms, there's a trade between them. And so we have the beginnings of sort of Black African enslavement moving into what would become Spain as early as about the 1200s.
Okay.
And then in the 1400s, the Portuguese begin to go that way. They want to go there because they know that it's really wealthy, right? So the best story is that there's a ruler of Mali called Mansa Musa, who's a Muslim. He's converted to Islam through these connections with North Africa, and he goes on the pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca. And Mali is one of the largest gold mining regions of the world. This is in the 1300s. And he brings so much gold with him to give as gifts to these other Muslim rulers that he's going to see on his way to the Arabian Peninsula, that he causes massive inflation in Europe and the Mediterranean. He brings so much gold that gold is worth less as a result of his trip. And part of that is why the Portuguese are interested in using boats to go there, because the problem is that North Africa, even after 1492, which is when the Spanish defeat the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, North Africa is still controlled by Muslim kingdoms. And so for the Portuguese to get to these really rich places like Mali, they have to find another way. And so they start going in boats. And in addition to getting things that they want, like gold and ivory, they find out that there is a trade in enslaved people. And part of that has to do with the way that African societies use enslavement. And it's different than what ends up happening in the Americas, but it does mean that there are people that could be purchased. And so the Portuguese begin to bring those people back because there then is a market for that. And so between the 13 and the 1400s and then like 1500, you have a lot of this trade. So by the early 1500s, there's some places, Lisbon would be a good example, Seville, Valencia, even places like Barcelona have about between like 5 and 10% of the population is Black. And that's the same moment when you have all of these Spaniards wanting to go over and conquer the Americas. And as a result, then they're bringing either free people of African descent or enslaved people, and then free Blacks in Spain are making the choice to go as well. And so you have this flow that goes along with them.
You mentioned that there are some free that they're looking for the wealth themselves, and the king will allow them to have that wealth. Yeah.
Well, what the king wants is his tax. The king doesn't care who's doing it. The king wants his tax.
Oh, so, really?
So, and the other thing to remember, which I think a lot of people forget, and this is true even for the US, right? A lot of the folks that come over and colonize, whether it's Jamestown or, up in Plymouth or pretty much anywhere, those people are doing it independently. No European power is using an army to come to the Americas. The king, whether it's the King of England or the King of France or the King of Spain, basically says, yeah, you can go do that, and you can do that in my name. And what you need to do is give me a cut of whatever you get. And for the Spanish, the cut is 20%. So you might have heard the phrase, the king's fifth.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the king says, whatever you get, whether it's gold or enslaved people or any other precious gems, spices, any of that, you pay me 20%. And so anyone that has the money to go over can go over, and they get to keep whatever they're not being taxed on.
I got you. So now, some of what you allude to, and you've already done it, is the relationships between Blacks and those Native
Americans. Yeah,
right.
And they're the ones that are being targeted by Europeans. And again, it's kind of the same picture, whether you're looking at someplace like Virginia or you're looking at Mexico. Europeans come in, they take territory, and that they either start wars with Native Americans, or what they do causes wars with Native Americans, and then they sort of beat them up even more. And then Africans, as I said, are part of this process, at least in the beginning, usually on the side of the Europeans. But then that can change.
When they go into Latin America, what happens?
When Africans go into Latin America?
And Europeans. You've alluded to that. That's part of what your topic is.
Yeah.
What happens?
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that happens is that from the Spanish point of view, and this is something that I think this is when we look at what happens in North America, right? So in places like Virginia or Massachusetts, it seems different, but I don't think it's as different as we think. The Spanish want to find people that can do the work, the heavy lifting. So a lot of what the Spanish do in conquering is trying to defeat Native Americans that then they can force to do work. In the beginning, they're going to enslave them, just like they are already used to having enslaved Africans, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the Native Americans in places like the Dominican Republic or Cuba begin to die off very quickly because of disease and abuse and overwork. The Spanish say, you can't enslave Native Americans. Now, they still do, and there's still ways that you can enslave Native Americans, but it means that they have to come up with different ways of coercing that labor, forcing that labor. So they come up with new mechanisms to do that. But there's a lot of places where, because of that mortality, that death of Native Americans, so places that I've looked at are the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right, when they were all Spanish, Panama, and then parts of Mexico, especially in the Caribbean areas. So like places like Cuba or the Dominican or Panama, Native Americans are decimated because they're abused, they're enslaved, they're overworked. And so you see within 15, 20 years, the population. So for example, Panama is the place that, the book that I've just written is about. Panama probably has about 250,000 Native Americans in 1510, right when Europeans.
Hold on, let me stop. You say Native American, but they're not American. They're native of that country.
Correct. Right.
Okay,
so
okay,
now
I got you.
I mean, the Spanish use the word Indian, right?
Yeah, right. I got you.
Right. So sometimes we use the word Amerindian, right, to refer because they are Indians of the Americas. Right?
I got you.
In Panama, that native population, that indigenous population, was about 250,000 people, and by 1520, so that's in 10 years, from 1510 to 1520, the population goes from about 250,000 to probably about 20,000. So you're looking at 90% death in Panama in a decade. And as a result, because the Spanish don't want to do the work themselves, they want other people to do the work of finding gold or building houses or working fields. They have to go someplace, and the place that they go is Africa. And they ask the Portuguese to keep bringing them Africans, and then which have been enslaved, and they use those enslaved Africans to do all the work. So again, Panama, which is the one that I've been working on a lot. Also, this is also true for the Dominican. Africans do everything, right? They're the farmers. They're the lumberjacks. They work the ships. They work with the livestock. They do everything. There's not a part of the economy that isn't being primarily worked by enslaved Africans. Mexico's a little bit different because the population, even though the native population drops, it starts out more with a population of like 4 million or 8 million, depending on how big of Mexico you're talking about. So even though it's going to fall quite precipitously, there's still hundreds of thousands of indigenous people to do work. And so when Africans come to Mexico, they end up being used in a narrower range of positions. So for example, I mentioned cowboys. They actually go into ranching very early. They also do a lot of urban work. So there's a lot of enslaved Africans in cities, either working in homes like domestic servants, or learning trades. So a lot of times, someone like, if you're a carpenter, you might buy an enslaved African to be your assistant, right? To be able to do your work. You do more work, right?
Let me ask you this. Excuse me for interrupting you. Let me go back just a tad here for this. Okay, so I'm already here in Panama. I'm a native of the country. I've come from somewhere to get to Panama. Then let me ask you this, and this is what that question came up. Where did I come from to get to Panama? What kind of person am I?
Yeah.
Before these invaders come.
Talking about people from like the natives of Panama, or the Africans that end up there. The natives of Panama. Sure. Well, I mean, we know that the Americas, the two continents, were inhabited by people going back at least 20,000 years.
Oh, okay.
And so in Panama, for example, there's been, we know from archaeology that there have been people in Panama for well over 10, 15,000 years. Now, some of those people, if you go way back to like 15,000 years, some of those people then went on and they went to parts of South America.
Okay.
The group of people that lived in Panama, the part of Panama that I study because of the Africans that ended up there, were called the Cueva. And that's the Spanish. The Spanish, Spaniards want to know, they want to get information about native people. So they actually learn native languages quickly and use it to gather information to help them find better places to go.
Okay.
So they learn languages, and the word cueva was the name of the language of the people that were there, right? So the Spanish talk about the people who speak cueva, and that was the group that lived there. Okay. And they, if you know anything about indigenous groups in North America, they would be somewhat similar in their life ways, like how they lived and the size of their societies, maybe to groups that lived in what we call the eastern woodlands of North America. So groups that lived in places like Tennessee or Alabama. At about the same time. So they lived in communities that certainly numbered at least in the hundreds. Probably some of them were in the thousands. Right. They built kind of long houses that often could hold at least one family, but sometimes more than one family. Okay. In Panama, they tended not to live on the coast. Panama is really mountainous. It's got a kind of the continental divide goes through Panama, right? So there's kind of mountains in the middle. Yeah. And so a lot of the Cueva lived on the slopes of the mountains along rivers that went to the ocean, either the Atlantic or the Pacific. But they didn't necessarily live right on the coastline.
Okay.
And they were farmers. Their basic subsistence. They grew corn, they grew squashes,
Okay.
and they hunted. They didn't have domestic animals the way that we do, but there was lots of native animals that they could hunt
Okay.
for.
Let me ask you this then. Okay, so now I'm living here on Panama.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden this ship shows up and I don't know who's on the ship.
Yep.
And do I greet them? And when is there a battle between us, the native people, and those invaders? And how does that battle go? I'm sure they got better weapons, what have you. And it doesn't take long to wipe us out to decide, okay, now I'm going from free to this economy, right, this civilization. These people are taking over my life. Yeah. What is that dynamic that happens right there?
That's a great question. So there's not one answer, because again, this part of it has to do with the individual Spaniards who are in charge of the journey. So for example, some of the first ships that come, it's exactly like you say, there's a ship off the coast. A couple of cases, there's shipwrecks, like there's a big storm off the coast that pushes the ships onto the shore. And so the Spaniards are shipwrecked. They have to fix their boats. And usually in that moment, the Spaniards are trying to at least be nice, right? They want food because they don't have enough food. They've been on ships, they've eaten all their food, or it's been lost. And so sometimes they try and sort of have some sort of more peaceful negotiation to kind of get supplies they need. But what often happens, and this is certainly true in Panama, is that moment gives way to violence, either because the Spanish ask for too much, or they don't get enough and they decide to use their weapons, which are, I should point out, they do have firearms, but firearms don't really work well in wet, humid areas. Like if your powder gets wet, you can't use them. And their guns are a lot more like a shotgun that you put rocks in than anything else. So a lot of what I'm talking about is probably they have firearms, but a lot of the fighting is actually with swords, or with crossbows. They use crossbows a lot more than they use firearms. But obviously a crossbow it can be more deadly at short range than a regular sort of arc bow that the Native Americans would have. So when it turns violent, you're exactly right. They can find themselves enslaved. They can find their communities burned to the ground. The Spanish will often take what they need and burn a community down. What often happens is a lot of these communities, when it does turn violent, they move. Right, so they leave the towns that they've built because they would do that anyways. They would move periodically because of the agriculture, right? So they would find, it's sort of like crop rotation, right? You can't use the same field the whole time, and so a lot of these groups would probably be moving, if not every year, they would move periodically to find areas where the soil has regenerated, right?
I got you.
So they can move a lot easier than maybe Spaniards can because they know the landscape, and so what happens is a lot of times when it gets violent, they run away, they go someplace else.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Then we on to something. You jamming? I'll be honest. How about this? You said earlier that there were 250,000 natives. Yeah. I don't remember the island, but whatever island.
Panama.
How many invaders were there to take over 250,000 people? Why couldn't the 250,000 people kill all them and then that be the end of it?
You know what? That's one of the biggest questions that historians have had, and we've tried to come up with a lot of ways. And you know what? Even historians from the moment. Have you heard of Bartolome de las Casas?
No.
Okay, so he's a member of the church, and he's writing about this like 20 years after it. He's present for some of it, and he's writing about it right as it happens. And even he doesn't have a really good answer for how this happens. But there's a couple explanations for how it happens. So in the case of Panama, so what ends up being the sort of moment when the Spanish go from having these sort of smaller scale encounters to really fighting and trying to take over land is that a fleet with 1,500 Spaniards comes. So you have 1,500 Spaniards, and the first city that they found is actually where no one in Panama is it's not very inhabited right now. It's still mostly indigenous. It's Darien, it's right near Colombia. And there's not enough food anymore. They've already enslaved the sort of native communities around it, but they can't grow enough food for 1,500 Spanish mouths. And so the Spaniards start going out to either bring back more people to have more farms and find more gold, but also then sort of, try and expand. And part of the reason why it is so horrible for native folks is that the Spanish are absolutely systematic about it. They go to one village with as many people as they can, they burn it down, they kill the leaders, right? They pick their battles so that those overwhelming numbers aren't always against them. And the thing that the Spanish also know is that there are lots of different groups, right? So for example, right around the area that we're starting, there's a town called Careta, there's a town called Tubaname, there's a town called Pacora, there's a town called Dabaya, right? There's all of these little towns, and they're not necessarily friends with each other. So often in the beginning, the Spanish can go to, say, Careta and say, why don't you join us, come with us, and we'll fight Pacora and defeat Pacora.
Really?
Right. And so what happens is that natives get pulled into these battles, and they do it everywhere. The Spanish do it. They do it in the Dominican with the indigenous groups that they find. They do it in Mexico, right? It's one of their tactics. And what ends up happening is, because indigenous peoples don't think of themselves as, oh, we're all Indians.
Yeah.
They don't have a big alliance against the Spanish.
Oh,
and so the
okay.
Spanish can really divide and conquer in ways that let them kind of target a very focused area.
I got you.
And then a lot of the death isn't just combat, right? So it's enslavement, right? So they defeat a community, they probably kill a lot of the men who were the fighters, the soldiers, the warriors, and then they take women, children, old people back to do the labor. But obviously old people and children aren't going to survive heavy labor.
Yeah.
Women aren't going to have kids if there's not men there. And so very quickly you can see how you could have, you might only kill, 30% of the people in combat, but 100% of the people aren't going to have kids anymore. And 100% of the people are going to be worked in conditions that might lead them to die within a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years.
I got you. Let me go back to this, because you're on to something. All of it you are. Okay, for example, like, let's go to Panama. How long does it take from when they first invade, if there's a date, to when they take over the island? How long does that take for them to take over a whole island, let's say?
Yeah, well, so Panama's not an island, it's on the mainland, but it ends up, it's kind of an island because it's really hard to move through the jungle. So in a lot of ways, from the Spanish point of view, they get to it by boat and they leave by boat. So it's sort of an island, even though it's connected to the mainland. And that's a great question. And actually, it sort of gets to one of the arguments that I've been making, is that what the Spanish do in Panama is that they make space for Africans to create their own kingdoms. Because what happens in Panama is that between 1514 and 1520, the Spanish kill, enslave, and also relocate most of the native peoples from Eastern Panama. So this is a map. So this is an old map, but it's showing where I'm interested. So the question that I'm interested in is precisely what we're talking about, which is, how does Spanish attacks and conquest of Native Americans make space for Africans to then resist the Spanish? All right. And so I'm interested in the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, I'm interested in Panama, and I'm interested in Mexico.
Okay, let me stop you there, and then we're gonna go, because you on to something. When you say they make space, the Africans are another group of people that come to the island?
Right.
Oh, yeah. I got you.
So here I'm gonna show you some maps. Right. We've been talking about Panama, but I've been looking at, like I said, I've been looking at these three places. So this is a map of Hispaniola, right? This is the Dominican and Haiti back when it was all Spanish. And what this is showing, the shaded areas are places where Africans, they run away from the Spanish and they create their own communities and they control those areas. They control them. The Spanish are not there and they defend them. And so the reason why this is important is that in 1492 or in 1510, a lot of these places were where there were the most Native Americans, indigenous people on the island. And the Spanish, because of what they did in terms of enslaving and killing, and then also moving them, right? Because the Spanish move Native peoples to their cities or to where they want to use their labor. That
on
means
the
that,
island.
On the island.
I got you.
So that means that there's no one there anymore, right? It would be
Right.
like if you took everyone in Kansas City and moved them someplace else. There's no one there, right? So then when these places have a lot more Africans, right? Because the Spanish bring Africans to them work. Those Africans go to those empty spaces and create their own. I mean, in some cases they call them kingdoms. So this is a map of where that happens on Haiti and the Dominican. We've been talking about Panama. So the place that in Panama, so this whole area, so there's the little dot that's in the bottom right, Santa Maria la Antigua. That's the first place the Spanish go. And what they do for that period that you asked me about from 1514 to 1520 is that they go up and down all of the rivers, all of the coastline, all the way over to where Panama City is. And all of those native peoples are either enslaved, killed, or relocated to Panama City. So everything there on the right side of that map is empty. I mean, there's probably still some native peoples that have fled and are hiding, but a lot of them are dead. And what happens then is when Africans come and they come to Nombre de Dios, which is that port, that dot on the top, and then Panama City, the dot on the bottom. So the Spanish Panama is a line between those two port cities.
Right.
And 70 to 80% of the residents of those two port cities are African. And so when those Africans say, I don't want to be here anymore, I don't want to work on the ships as a slave, I don't want to work the fields as a slave, I don't want to live in this house as a slave, where do they go? They go to that place that has now empty because all of the native peoples have been killed or relocated, and they create their own kingdoms.
Okay. I got you.
And it happens in Mexico too. So here, this is sort of early Mexico. So on the right side, you have the Gulf of Mexico where the Spanish port is. And on the left side, you have Mexico City, which is the biggest city that they have.
Right.
And the shaded area here, which is kind of on these mountains, is where a lot of Africans go. And a lot of those Africans, so those Africans are some of the first sugar plantation workers. And just like they do in other places, they say, I don't want to work sugar plantation. And so where do they go? They go to the mountains. And they set up their own cities and kingdoms up there.
Okay, hold on. Now, you good. Okay, when they go, they don't go willingly. They tell them where you're going. This is where we're going to take you to do your job, right?
Right.
When they go, we're going to take you there. That's where you're going to do your job. Are there more Africans and native people who populate the island? What's the more of them than it is of the European or the Spanish invaders?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I guess the question could be, if somehow they could have come together, got them some guns and arms trade, they could have wiped them out and made them leave.
Yeah, and that, you know what? So this is something that Europeans kind of know. So there's a good story about this. All right.
Yeah.
So all right, you know how the English and the Spanish kind of don't like each other, right?
Right. Okay.
So one of the things that the English do during this period that I study, so like the 1500s, the English don't have any colonies yet, right? Jamestown 1607, Plymouth is, 1620. They don't have any
Okay.
colonies. But the English want to make money off of what's happening. So some of the early guys that go into the Atlantic from England, they want to deal in slaves. They want to make money on enslaved Africans. And what they do is they either go to Africa and try and buy them on the coast, or when that gets really hard, they just capture Portuguese ships that are carrying enslaved Africans.
Oh, really?
And then they try and sell them to the Spanish. It happens in the Dominican. It happens here. But one of these guys, one of the early guys, is a guy named John Hawkins. And he does this. He tries to do this 3 times. He makes 3 trips to Africa. They're not really successful, but they know what they want. They want to make money on the slave trade. And they're not really able to do it. But one thing that happens is that they run into some bad luck in that if we go back to our map here of Mexico,
Yeah.
they bring this fleet. They know that there's a Spanish fleet out there, and they're trying to make money off the Spanish. And so there's this English fleet hanging out off the coast of Mexico, right as the fleet from Spain is coming with the new viceroy. So the viceroy is the most important official in Mexico.
Okay.
And the 2 fleets fight, and the English are scattered. And a bunch of them shipwreck on the coast, kind of north of where my map is here.
Okay.
And they're captured. They're captured by Spaniards. They're also captured by Indians who are part of the militia. And I would be willing to bet dollars to donuts that there's a number of free Africans that are also out there looking for them and are part of the group that captures them.
Okay.
And they go back to Mexico City. And the problem is that the international law is really shady. And so the question is, what law are the Spanish going to try these Englishmen for violating? And what they decide is that it's actually religion. Catholic Mexico is Catholic. Spanish Mexico is Catholic, and they're Protestants, right? These are, for the most part, these are guys who are Protestant, like Queen Elizabeth I.
Okay.
And so they say, you're heretics, and you're trying to spread Protestantism in Mexico. And so instead of putting them in a criminal court, they actually put them in a church court, the Inquisition. They go before the Inquisition for being heretics. And one of the most interesting pieces is that there's testimony. They're interviewing these guys about, why are you here? What are you doing? Why do you want to spread Protestantism? And there's an English sailor who points out exactly what you said. He said, you guys better watch out, because we'll come back and we're going to talk to your Africans, right? He calls them blacks, right? Your blacks.
Sure.
And we're going to talk to your Indians, and they're going to join us, and we're going to kick you out.
Now we're moving up the timeline, but the timeline says eventually they do leave, don't they? The invaders, the European invaders.
It's a question, right? So in the case of Mexico, in the case of a lot of Latin America, yes, they stopped being Spanish or Portuguese, but the people in charge are still the children of those invaders.
Yeah, right.
Right. And there are places that are different, right? Places like Panama, places like the Dominican, where you do have a lot more Afro residents, where obviously the people in charge are black, right? Or identify as black or Afro Latino, right? There's places like Brazil where you have a lot of black folk, black Brazilians, but if you look at the politicians, they're still almost all white, and there's other places like that too. Colombia is a good example. There's a lot of Afro-Colombians, but the politicians of modern Colombia are still mostly the descendants of the Spanish that stayed there, not the Africans that came there.
Now, as we talk about this that happened in the Latin America, in the Latin areas, that it's a similar type concept of what happened in Florida, and that's what you were sharing earlier, right?
Yeah. So I mean, the thing that what Jane has studied in Florida, this is really similar stuff. And Jane, she's an excellent scholar. She's been really interested, just like I am, in the Africans who resist empire in all of these ways. So she's published articles that have to do with Panama, have to do with all of these places. She knows all the same sources that I'm using here. And so that what we're interested in is how can we understand what Africans do to challenge empire, right? So I argue one of the things that I say is that Africans, when they come to places like the Dominican or Panama or Mexico, they actually create they conquer, right? What they do is they conquer spaces for themselves and they defend those spaces from an empire. And the story that's really amazing, you want to talk about strong inspiration? The story that in Panama is inspiring.
Hold on, let me go back. You got me, honey. Hold on. Before you tell that story, they conquer. So now they're brought here as slaves.
Yeah.
But then they rise up in revolts, and that when you say conquer, a revolt is the conquering.
Right.
I got you.
So what Jane was talking about, she was talking about one of the very earliest ones. I think it was the 1520 revolt in Hispaniola, right? Sometimes it's a big revolt like that where a lot of them get together and they fight and they run away themselves. In Panama, where I'm looking, there's less of that, but a lot more sort of individuals who kind of run away as individuals, and then outside of the Spanish cities, outside in the forests, in the jungles, they find each other, and then they create their own communities and kingdoms there. So it can happen a bunch of different ways. But the argument that I make is that all of the ways that it happens, that in fact, we can call it resistance. It is resistance, right? They're resisting slavery.
Right.
But it's more than that. It's not just that they're resisting slavery, they're creating their own polities, right? There's just a fancy word for a state, right? They're creating their own states and kingdoms.
Okay.
And the Spanish are not there.
Okay, but then your last comment gets me to this. If my slaves here in the Panama, they run off to some other part and they create, and the Africans create their own, why don't I just go over there and get them and bring them back?
That's a great question. I can give you a couple answers to it, because that means you have to get your sword and your crossbow, and you got to pay a lot of other people to go with you, and you got to go into the woods that you don't know, right? You've never been there.
I got you.
And it costs a lot of money. There's another great case that I have from Mexico. So I mentioned the Viceroy, right? Who's the most important person in the Spanish system. The Viceroy of Mexico is talking about a group of these Africans, actually in the map that I have on the screen right now.
Yeah.
It's up in this area here. The Africans that are in that shaded area on the mountain.
Yeah.
He's talking about them. And he says, here's the problem. He's writing to the king. He says, King, here's the problem. Either you spend your money, right? The money of the royal treasury, or I should say, I, as the Viceroy, spend your money to put together an army or an expedition, which costs you money. But the problem is that, as you said in your question, it's the owners, it's the slave owners who caused it, right? They're the ones who let their slaves run away, right? Within the Spanish mentality, they let Africans run away, but they don't want to pay out of pocket for it. And so the Viceroy is saying that's the problem. They don't want to pay, which means that if we're going to solve the problem, then we pay. And what's kind of funny about that example is that he's one of the slave owners. He has family connections that has sugar estates in this region. And so he knows very well what the problem is. The problem is that the Spanish, the owners, like the businessmen, right? It's sort of like today when you think about the problem of undocumented labor, right?
Yeah, sure.
So in American businesses need labor, and they don't mind paying for undocumented labor, to pick strawberries or whatever, but the government does. So who's going to enforce it, right? The private business benefits from it. They don't want to pay extra money for it. Same thing here. The slave owners, they don't want to spend extra money to go after enslaved Africans that have run away. They want the king to do it, but the king doesn't want to spend his money to do it when it's their problem.
I got you. Okay, let me ask you this question, and maybe you've answered this. How long after the Africans got there, and let's go with Panama, the Africans get there, starting at such and such period, they last, the invasions of the Africans last so long. How long is it that the Africans are enslaved before they start moving and developing their own communities and then starting to dilute slavery among them? Is that, you follow me there?
Yeah, I absolutely follow you.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things, the problem for this far back, right, is that we don't have great stories of individuals, right?
I got you.
So we don't have a lot of like slave narratives the way that we might for a later period, right? You know,
I got you.
For the US, we have
I
you know
got you.
narratives of folks that were on the Underground Railroad.
Right, I got you.
But what I can say, and I am without fear of contradiction, is that immediately, right, as soon as Africans are brought, some of them will run away. And if you look at dates, so as I said, in Panama, 1520 is about when the fighting against native people stops. By 1525, so within like 5 years, they're already complaining that Africans have run away and are in the countryside.
Okay, I got you. Interesting. Now, as we kind of come to a close, okay, when they decide to run away, and human nature will make you do that. I mean, I don't like this, and I'm not going, this is not what I want to live like. If we add religion and God gives them something to say, this is how you counteract that. And that's running away to the bush area where you could be safe.
Right.
Because I got a guy on the channel, he's out of Jamaica, and I asked him, I said, well, how did slavery? He said they ran up into the hills. And then they had a woman who fought them off, and you know her name. They weren't going up there. So that was their only way.
Yep.
Because there was no free territory on the island.
Yeah, but so the story about Jamaica and Panama, they're really a story of, you know, how history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes does, right? So the story that I find so inspiring is that in Panama, just like in Jamaica, these Maroons keep the Spanish at bay. They fight them. They fight them with arms. They run away when they have to. They fight them when they have to for 50 years. And by 1582, the Spanish agree to give the Maroons 2 free communities. They say, all right, those of you that are over here are going to go to this town, and those of you that are over here are going to go to this town. You can run them, right? Your leaders are the leaders of the new town. You are free people, and this is your town. And that's exactly as you said. That's what happened in Jamaica, right? Nanny, who was the leader of that, their town became Nanny Town, right? And in fact, the crazy thing about Jamaica is that when the English decide, or the British, I guess by that point, decide to have that agreement with the Maroons in Jamaica, they say in their own documents, in the official correspondence, they say, this is what the Spanish did in Panama. And so the Maroons of Jamaica actually benefit from the fact that the Maroons in Panama, 150 years before, won the war, right? They fought the Spanish to a standstill and got free towns for themselves, got their freedom, got their own towns. The Maroons in Jamaica got it because the English knew that at least worked to stop the fighting, and that was a way that they could stop this from being this constant war against kind of guerrilla fighters. The Maroons is kind of being guerrilla fighters, and yeah, they had to give these people their freedom. They had to give them their own towns, but it stopped the fighting. And those 2 stories are linked, and a lot of people don't know that.
I guess my last question is this. Now, Haiti has probably a similar story to what you're talking about in Panama and so on and so forth. Haiti is the first country to get away from to gather its independence.
Correct. Yep.
When Haiti does that, what's the independence of Panama and some of the other countries? Is it many years later that they then have similar success?
Right. So yeah, it's tricky. I mean, Jamaica doesn't become technically I mean, it's still part of the Commonwealth. So you know, but it became self-governing in the 20th century. So the connection, I'll give you 2 connections to Haiti, which is a little bit different than what you asked, but I think it fits with what you're interested in.
Right.
So the first one is, I actually wrote an article, and I pointed out that the fact that there's Haiti, right? So Haiti becomes a French colony. One of the reasons why it becomes a French colony is because of Africans. So if you remember my map that I have
Right.
of the Dominican, right? There are so many Africans on the kind of on the edge of Spanish settlements
Right.
that one of the reasons why the Spanish they actually leave that side of the island, right? So the Spanish relocate everyone away from the west and the north of the island. And one of the reasons why they do that is because there's so many African Maroons there. So there's two, one of the arguments for doing it is that all of the Spaniards are trading illegally with the English and the Dutch and whatever. And that's what most people who study where Haiti comes from said. So the Spanish got rid of the settlements because they were worried about illegal trading.
Okay.
But the actual source is it's illegal trading and African Maroons. And so I actually make the argument that one of the reasons why we end up getting a French part of that island is because African Maroons had made it so difficult for the Spanish to control that they threw up their hands and went away. And then the French come in, and one of the problems that goes all the way back to even the beginning of the French before the Haitian Revolution is runaway slaves.
Okay.
There's Maroons up and down the border between those two, the Spanish and the French part, the entire time. And they participate in the Haitian Revolution, right? So part of Haiti, even 3 centuries before the revolution, the story of Haiti starts with Maroons on that island, and it also then ends with Maroons on that island.
Okay.
So that's one of the things.
Okay.
And the other thing that I think is important is that Haiti is absolutely important as the first successful rebellion by slaves that leads to independence, right? But I think that some of these earlier stories, we should also think of them as successful, right? Even if they don't become independent countries, that if it's the difference between being killed or recaptured or re-enslaved,
Sure.
the fact that in places like Jamaica, in Mexico, in Panama, in Colombia, and Brazil, there are these communities that fight Europeans to a standstill, to a draw, and then are able to force Europeans to give them their freedom and to give them self-governing towns. It's not the same as Haiti, but it's a step in that direction, right?
Okay.
It's a step towards greater liberty, even if it's not independence.
So I guess my last question, Haiti kind of starts it off.
Well, I would say that these started off and Haiti is the culmination, right? So I would say that like what you see here is the beginnings of it and like little successes, right? Little successes. And then Haiti is the big success where not only do they fight Europeans to a standstill, and the thing about Haiti that's so amazing is that the Haitians not only defeat the French, they defeat the Spanish, they defeat the English, and then they are able to declare their independence. But all of these stories that I'm telling that happened earlier are little successes that lead to that.
I got you. Hey, well, we're going to stop there only for the sake of time, so on and so forth. I got, let's stop there.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Going, and I want to have you back on. Thank you so very much. Everybody, did y'all get anything out of that? Well, I did, and I know you did. I'm not even asking, did you? Because he explained it so well, and now we understand a little bit. We're going beyond America in this discussion. We're going a little bit ahead of that. Now, America doesn't really come in until the when did they go into Florida? The 1500s, when?
Yeah, so Florida gets Spaniards in about the 1560s.
So that's after all the Caribbean things that have happened. Everybody hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspiration. Come on now. I don't know why you haven't so far. Hit the like button on this video because I know he told you something that you like and I like. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up, you get notified, and tell somebody about Strong Inspirations because we are giving it to you straight, no chaser. I'm fine. I've told you he's an expert. Didn't I tell you that at the beginning? And now you know for yourself. Tell us the name of your books and your website.
Sure. So you can, I mean, you can look me up on KU's website, but the book that's probably more interesting to this topic is African Maroons in 16th Century Panama. It's on Amazon. And then my first book, which is the one that looks at kind of racial categories in Mexico, is Géneros de Gente in Early Colonial Mexico.
Okay.
Yep. And both of those are on Amazon.
Do you happen to have a website yourself or something that people can follow?
I don't have a standalone, and I got to follow your example and make my own. But
Yeah.
you can.
Yeah,
all of my stuff is at the KU website.
Okay, we're gonna put that under the description, the titles of the books. I'm gonna beg him back on, everybody. Trust me, I got to have him back on. We got, because there's other angles to this, I'm sure. I mean, I know we didn't cover it all in the hour of time that we've had here. And thank you for coming on the channel. I really mean that. That you've taken time out of your busy schedule to do this, and excitingly as you have too. And I say this with all sincerity, and I mean this. I like it that you have gone from where you have with the background, understanding history, and taking it to the next level, found your niche, and explored it to be as thorough as you have. And so I say to you, please stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind, keep finding some other little nitpick, and I know you're looking for it, some documents that will be another ha-ha moment, and keep sharing that with the world. With that, I'll say, you speak Spanish?
I do, yeah.
And you say, how do you say Spanish, goodbye in Spanish?
Adios.
Adios. I could have known that one. Thank you so very much for coming on the channel. All right.